All right, folks, you know the drill. It is time for another exciting episode of Virtual Astronomy Live. Look, we're going to do the infinite DOS thing today because I've got the web page that shows the stream in the background here. Isn't that fantastic? It's a very special show today. We're going to give just a couple minutes for the invitations, the notifications, and stuff like that to go out. But if you can hear me, post over in chat, whichever chat you're watching. We're going out on all the channels here today. We're on 2 different Twitch channels. We should be over on YouTube with the Intrepid's YouTube channel, and we're also on the Intrepid's Facebook channel. Facebook channel? I don't think that's what they're calling it. Now I'm dating myself here. But anyways, they're on Facebook too today. So let me know, whichever chat you're in, tell me hi if you can see this. I see Scottish fella already coming through. And Reese, 32, with a resub as well. Thank you, Reese. And we've got Liz Jest. Liz Jest List, I guess, is twice in a row there. Danger Tater as well. Ice Skull. Alicia Siegel. Wait, is she allowed to watch? I think so. How's it going, Alicia? How are you doing today? So we are going to get going here shortly with another Virtual Astronomy Live. You know, this is our monthly show we do with Intrepid Museum. And a very special show today, talking about accessibility in space and museums. As it turns out, we're going to be learning about some of the hidden heroes of space research. Some individuals with some different perception that was actually quite useful to NASA. We'll learn a little bit more about how they were able to help NASA whenever we were learning to go into space and how space was actually going to affect the human body in ways that we didn't exactly understand very well yet. This is a story that I didn't even know. And until I got sort of this show with the museum where we're going to be talking through this old research that was done, it was something that, I know about food on the ISS and I know about asteroids, but I did not know about this, which is going to be very interesting to learn about today. But it looks like across the board, I'm seeing chat come in from all the different channels. I've got Ryan over there, Fellow Bear as well on Twitch. Still, we got Liz over there in the Intrepid's channel. I'm seeing everything over on YouTube as well. Some people will show up at some point. Looks like Facebook's working fine. So again, across the board, welcome to another Intrepid Museum Virtual Astronomy Live. It's a live show. We actually do this, not really much of a script or anything. You may have noticed because I just talk all the time. So if you have questions for us over the course of the show today, you can actually put them in chat. Help me out a little bit. And if you have a question, just say question and then put your question. And over the entire course of the show, we've got some really cool software on the back end that'll take your questions and keep them. And the last 30 minutes of the show are actually going to be Q&A. So you'll get a chance to ask your questions, whichever channel you're on, wherever you're watching, to our special guests today. But we do this every single month. We have a little bit of a pre-show that comes through, and I am joined today by a very special guest from the museum itself, Charlotte Martin. Charlotte, how are you doing today?
Hi, I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Let's see. Chat, let us know. Can you hear Charlotte okay there? Charlotte, tell them hi one more time. Are you on the deck of the Intrepid, or is that a green screen?
This is a virtual background of me on the flight deck. I'm actually sitting just below that section of the flight deck, but my office is much less interesting to look at.
Than the flight deck, huh? Chat, let us know we're able to hear Charlotte just fine. Okay, all my little lights are blinking correctly, so I assume you can hear her just fine. So just let us know what's going on there. Oh, we'll turn you up just a little bit, it looks like. There we
Great.
go. All right. So Charlotte, what are we talking about today? This is sort of a different topic, and we've got all sorts of other stuff on the screen. What's going on here today?
Yeah, so this one's a little bit different. We're actually going to be looking inside the museum today. We were inspired by the topic that we'll be exploring today, which is one that we've been really interested in for a long time, and are actually hoping to feature this story and are planning to feature this story we'll be talking about at the museum in an exhibition in the future. But in the meantime, we actually have up an exhibition now that we're calling Making History Accessible.
Okay.
That's all about how historic sites, historic museums, can actually improve their sensory interpretation, how we can better use different senses to interpret history at these sites. And that's really challenging for a lot of historic sites. They tend to be really small or have weird, awkward spaces and have very small budgets and staff. And so this is a collaboration across the country with sites and with disability advocates to develop prototypes that we're building here and at the NYU Ability Project,
Okay.
and kind of testing those out.
Cool. So this is sort of an exhibit at the museum that's almost sort of about museum exhibits or ways of communicating, I guess is the right way to say it, right?
Exactly. It is. It's a little meta. It is an exhibit about how we do museum work, basically, how it is that we tell stories in museums in ways that are interesting and help reveal things that might not be obvious or that might normally have barriers to certain visitors, that might present barriers, whether a physical barrier or a communication barrier. And we want to really break those down so that we can tell better, richer stories and have those accessible to a wider population to make sure we're not excluding visitors, including visitors with disabilities who want to visit our sites and contribute and get that history. And so we're really excited to actually test it out. We actually invited people to share their feedback on the exhibit so that we can improve that. And now these other historic sites will have their own versions of this.
Yep.
And we'll get even more feedback, which we're really excited about.
Very cool. And I mean, we're saying the exhibit at the museum. I mean, the exhibit is actually at the museum, and the museum is open now. Like, you can visit the museum in New York City. Is it still limited hours or?
So we are now open every day.
Open every day.
From 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. We will be closed on Thanksgiving and Christmas, but otherwise we are open, and we would love to have you here. If you're local to New York City, actually, we actually reduced our admissions price by 50% for New York City residents. So you should definitely come and visit. And this exhibit will be open until the end of November, so you still have a little time to come and check it out. But it is also available online at wp.nyu.edu/MHA. And that is, so you can still learn about what we'll be talking about here as well.
All right. One of the mods, put the link in the chat there. Could you repeat that, Charlotte?
Yeah, wp.nyu.edu/MHA.
All right.
So.
Sounds good. So let's get the link in chat over there. You can click on it. You can check that out, y'all. But I think we have a little bit of a video here that was recorded inside the museum, right?
Yeah, so this video is just a short walkthrough that I did of the exhibit, kind of talking about what we feature, the challenges that we were trying to address, and how we kind of worked through that, as well as some of the feedback we got. There's one component that I don't talk about in the exhibit, and that is the accessible interactive mobile guide that the Intrepid Museum developed with NYU Ability Project initially during the height of the pandemic as we were preparing to reopen. And this really brings together content that we had in many different places into one accessible mobile site that anyone can access, whether they're at the museum or even at home or elsewhere. So I don't talk about that as much in this part. We focus really on the exhibit elements. So
all right.
Yeah.
Well, are we ready to roll the tape here?
I'm ready if you are.
All right, here we go.
Challenges facing many historic sites is that the artifacts that they care for are fragile or rare and not available to visitors to touch. And touch can be really beneficial for a wide variety of visitors. For example, visitors who are blind or have low vision can use touch to learn about an artifact that they wouldn't be able to get simply through description. It can also benefit other visitors drawing out details that they might not have noticed just through looking at something, and to give a sense of the material and texture that might be hard to convey just through looking at something, especially if it's behind glass. And so NYU students teamed up with McCullough Hall in New Jersey to figure out low-cost and effective ways of making touch available to visitors in historic sites. Daniel Johnston, the NYU student, actually documented all of this on his website, which we'll make available to you as well. And through this challenge, they decided to focus on a 18th century portrait of George Washington, an oil painting. And so Daniel worked with the site and with Intrepid Museum exhibition staff to figure out how to do this. They used a variety of low-cost, readily available materials and computer software to do this. Now, one thing that Daniel had to think about and the others on the team had to think about was how to focus on the correct details. Daniel went into the computer and basically drew out the different layers of the painting, trying to decide how much detail to show. And so we have some of those prototypes here on view. And one thing that we have to be careful of is tactile clutter, making sure that there's not so much information that it gets lost as people are touching. And so the team decided to focus on details they wanted to convey. What is the story that this object, that this artifact, that this painting was going to tell? In this case, they were concerned about the aging of George Washington's face. And so focusing on how his face changed over time. And so they decided on a comparison of a younger portrait of George Washington with a portrait of him much older. And by focusing on the way that the shape of his face changed as his jowls grew over time, they were really able to bring out that aging aspect that might not be obvious just by looking at something. He used layered cardboard, very inexpensive, along with muslin to create something that's easy to make, inexpensive, and available to most historic sites. And we can see that here in the layers that we have, as well as in the final finished product. This is very resilient. People can touch it over and over again, but it's also easy to recreate if needed. And so you're able to bring out those details. The feedback has been really positive in that it can bring out some of those details people wouldn't notice otherwise. Some noted that it might be helpful to include some key features like the eyes, which can help orient someone as they're kind of feeling their way through this object here. It does take some familiarity, perhaps with CAD software or with materials. And so if that's not something that's on a historic sites team, they might be able to partner with a local university, many of which have maker spaces, and students and professors who might be willing to partner up on a project like this. And so this is just an example of the ways that we can bring touch experiences into a historic site. Now, in many historic sites, there are often areas that are just inaccessible to many visitors or even all visitors. An example of this was at one of our partner sites, Louisiana State Museum, which at one of their locations had a stove that was in an area not accessible to visitors, but that many people were curious about and wanted to learn more. And so the team at the Intrepid Museum and Louisiana State Museum started to think through how they could bring this out from behind glass. And we did this in a few different ways. And that's something that comes up in a lot of these components, is that you need a multi-pronged approach. Have different choices for different visitors who might prefer to interpret things in different ways, get their information in different ways. And so one component of this was actually creating a full-scale tactile replica of a portion of the stove, which we have here. Now this was made with not the original cast iron, but other kind of plastic materials that are much more affordable to build out of. And so we have this here to create a sense of the detail and texture on this historic stove. We also have down here a replica kettle, iron kettle, that would have been on the stove. Now this is actually on the location that it would have been on the stove relative to this tactile replica here. You can see how low it is. And we wanted to give visitors the opportunity to feel it and lift it. But we also knew that this could be a safety issue, having something so heavy readily available for folks to handle. And so we built this case around it. We have an opening where we can feel that texture, that cast iron, and also the opportunity to lift it in a safe way and really feel the heft of that kettle. And as I mentioned, it's actually on the spot that it would have been on the full-scale stove. We also wanted to give an opportunity to tell different stories about this, different experiences of this stove. And so our colleague at the Louisiana State Museum collected a series of different interpretations of this based on the experiences of those speakers. So we have a historian's perspective, a docent's perspective, and a cook's perspective, each one sharing different aspects, different context for this object. And this is also available by accessing the QR code that has the website with the recordings available, as well as transcripts, to make that accessible to different folks. I'll also note that we have a hearing loop above us. So for those who use hearing aids with T-coils, they can hear that audio directly in their hearing aids. We've gotten some great feedback on this. It really helps create a sense of that scale, a sense of this object. but also that there are some limitations. So some of the feedback that we noted are that it's great to have the kettle where it would be on the stove, but it also makes it a little bit more difficult for someone perhaps in a wheelchair or with other mobility restrictions to be able to access this feature. So that's something to consider as well. We also would place these buttons probably in a different spot so that they're easier for more people to reach. And we would also add some braille for those who are blind or have low vision and use braille to access information. But overall, it does kind of bring this space alive in a way that wouldn't be possible because it is behind glass. So this is one component that could also be replicated at other sites, just thinking about what are some objects that we can get replicas of, what are things that we can recreate in a way that people can touch it, hear it, and experience it. Perhaps adding smells and other sort of sound effects, which we'll actually get to a little bit later. One additional suggestion was actually to create a full, smaller model of the stove to help provide that context. So someone who's using touch to orient themselves around it can get a better sense of where these individual components would actually fit onto the full stove. So that's just one thing to consider, is all the different ways that people gather information. One group of NYU students focused on language accessibility and description, wanting to create a toolkit for historic sites inspired partially by the Smithsonian Guidelines for Accessible Exhibition Design, so that historic sites can actually do some of this work on their own. When thinking about language accessibility, we're thinking about how technical, especially overly technical language, can be a barrier for folks who are perhaps English language learners, have reading disabilities, language-related disabilities, or just don't have a lot of background in the area. And so our curator, Jessica Williams, wrote 2 versions of a label for this artifact here, a chart plotting board. One using very technical language and detail, and the other using more plain language, which the toolkit goes into, best practices on. And so this makes it so that you don't need to have a lot of technical knowledge, technical detail, or special vocabulary to be able to gather the key information and point behind having this object on display. In addition, I also recorded audio of these 2 labels, as well as audio description to go along with that. Because thinking about the type of language you're using also applies to the audio description that's going to make the object available and accessible to a visitor who's blind or has low vision, or someone else who likes having that additional description to guide them as they're looking at the object. And so in our exhibit, it's available by pressing these buttons to the side of the object. We did get feedback to add some braille for that. It's also available by visiting the website in the QR code to find those recordings as well as the transcripts that go along with them, making those more readily available. And so it's really important to think about how we're communicating information, and by having a toolkit available to historic sites that empowers curators, historians, writers, educators to consider the language that they use as well as the descriptions that they're providing. I'll note that some visitors do prefer the more technical, kind of jargon-heavy version of the label. And so it's important to have those layers of information available, which is something that Lauren and Cheryl discussed with our Bring Your Own Accessible Device mobile guide, thinking about how we can provide those different types of information to visitors who might want a slightly different experience from one another. So as museums increasingly incorporate the voices of people who've been left out of the historical record traditionally, or left out of museum storytelling traditionally, we have to think about how we can incorporate these new voices in ways that are flexible for the teams at these sites, and make sure that we not only have the stories available, but we have these stories available in a way that is accessible to the widest possible group of visitors. And so NYU students in the Intrepid Museum teamed up with Bainbridge Island, the historic site there, to think about ways that we can incorporate multiple perspectives and types of interpretation, both physically and digitally. And we have some of those components here in this exhibit. So, for example, thinking about how we can bring out historic photos that maybe haven't been included in exhibitions before, and adding other layers of interpretation. So we have here, for example, one historic photo that includes a black and white portrait of 3 men and boys sitting on a large felled tree. And so we can include the saw here, but we also have this raised plastic on here. And so when I mentioned the saw earlier, we have here the serration of the saw available to help kind of feel the texture of that, as well as the outline of the other individuals here. So just a way of adding a tactile element while still making that historic photo available. And something to consider is the amount of detail that you want to include in a tactile like that. And that's something that you'll want to work with user experts on, as we did throughout the process to get feedback. And that's something that shows up in all of these, is that as we were developing these, we were getting feedback and talking to our disability advocates and other user experts throughout to make sure that we were developing these in a way that made sense. And these are still prototypes here. So thinking about how we can bring in perspectives through photos, through touch, but also through other senses and other ways of storytelling. And so, for example, also thinking about smell. On Bainbridge Island, there are special strawberries that grow there. And so we wanted to include that smell. Now, smell we have to be careful with, because smell can really help bring out memory, can be a really powerful and wonderful sensory experience. But we also want to make sure that we're not overwhelming visitors and they're able to opt into that experience. There are folks who are sensitive to fragrance and smell, or might have a really strong emotional reaction to smell. And we want to give people that choice. And so the exhibits team at the Intrepid Museum came up with a way of being able to maintain smell by getting special oils and very absorbent cloth that they could keep in a case. And then visitors have the option to slide the cover open, and have the smell come through this perforated surface here. I do love the smell of strawberries, so I'll keep that open for a moment. But it's something that visitors can opt into and have that choice to have that experience. And so we have some other examples also here. The other component is having ways to tell these stories and be able to adapt them throughout and add new stories, change stories. And one way to do that is digitally. And so a group of NYU students started to prototype ways of layering storytelling through a mobile site. So it could be an extension of the Bring Your Own Accessible device. It could also be something standalone. It could include things like AR, augmented reality, so that as you shift over an object, different people come up and you can hear their stories. So thinking about different ways that you can bring together the physical interpretation and the digital interpretation to tell some of those stories, and getting feedback throughout. Throughout the exhibit, we also include kind of the storyboarding for the way that they would develop this site, knowing that you're going to get feedback, you're going to want to change it and make sure that you're making the best use of it. And so that's something that is included on the site for this exhibit, where you can actually see the way that they plotted that out over time. I'd like to introduce our final presenter, Marilee Mostoff.
I was like, wait a second, another presenter? I think I missed an email
Just
somewhere,
me.
Charlotte, didn't I?
No, just me.
So that's interesting, because you're talking all about things that traditionally, if you've gone to museums, you think you might not get to do. Like, you don't normally get to touch things. There's all the don't touch exhibits and that sort of thing, especially for historical artifacts. But this exhibit was all about how you can convey the experience to people using things like touch and smell and all that sort of thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We know that people learn and experience the world using a wide range of senses, and so we want to make that available to more people. And yeah, touch is something that's really underutilized, underused in museums. But that touch experience, that smell experience, they really can bring memories to life and really help us make associations and connections, and make it just a richer experience, especially when we're trying to tell stories that we haven't always done a great job of telling in the past.
That's very cool. So while you were going through that, it's always makes me think about something that maybe I haven't thought about before, which is one of the reasons we do this. And I was thinking, when you walk onto the Intrepid, it was an active aircraft carrier. It used to be an active aircraft carrier sailing out on the ocean with planes and people and oil and fuel and all that sort of stuff. And still, when you walk aboard the Intrepid, there's a smell you can't opt out of. You can smell that sort of Intrepid smell. Can I call it the Intrepid smell?
Yes.
Like there's like a very specific smell, and I haven't got to go to the Intrepid in quite some time, and I miss it. And as you were there talking through things, it's like, you go there and you sort of know that you're not in a clean room museum. You know that you're walking through a piece of history when you visit the Intrepid in person, right?
Absolutely. I mean, that's part of what makes these spaces so special is really getting that history, being immersed in it, having that hard steel deck under your feet, which after a full day can be pretty tiring, but
yep.
It gives you that connection. And yeah, that Intrepid smell is real. We fortunately don't have all the diesel fumes and sweat of 3,000
Yep.
men on the equator, overwhelming us. But it does have its own kind of background scent. And I'll say, like, when I was working from home during the height of the pandemic, I brought home like my fleece and stuff, and I could like smell it on my fleece.
Yep.
That smell of the ship. So
Yep.
it's definitely something really meaningful and tangible to people. Our submarine is where it gets a little more intense because there is still the engine room.
Yeah, that's true.
That smells of diesel. So we try to warn people of that so they can opt in
Yep.
to that experience.
To know that it's going to be there. Every time I come back from the Intrepid, I get on the plane and my clothes are all packed up, and I get home and I open it and I can smell the Intrepid in my suitcase.
Mm-hmm.
So anyways, it is time for us to get some of our other special guests on here. Y'all, massive thanks to Charlotte here. Charlotte, first time you've been on Virtual Astronomy Live with us, huh?
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us here, and great work with the fantastic job there with the sensory sort of exhibit you were putting together. That's really cool.
Great. Thanks so much.
All right. So, folks, we are going to be a little bit AFK for just a second. When we come back, we'll have our special guest talking about the unsung, the unknown heroes of space research. But just stand by. You know how it is. You get the little spinny shield and stuff. And when we come back, we'll have our special guest. Now, remember, the Virtual Astronomy Live is supported through a NASA cooperative agreement awarded to the New York Space Grant Consortium. The streams don't just happen. So, wherever you're watching from, thank you all for showing up and joining in to this event that was made possible by that cooperative agreement. Let's put it that way. We'll be right back, and when we come back, we'll have our special guest. So hang in there, y'all. All right, folks, we are back with some familiar faces that you've seen on the stream before. Summer Ash, our moderator, joining us here today. Summer, thank you so much for being with us.
I just have the one face.
It's just the one face. Just one face. And you are going to introduce our special guest. So I'm going to turn the show over to you and tell us about what we're going to hear about today.
I am, but can I first say that I too miss the smell of the Intrepid?
Ah, yes. It definitely has a smell, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's like grease.
It is
And,
gear oil and airplanes. Like it's
yeah, and that cold metal walls,
yep.
steel. Yeah.
All
Visceral
right.
experience.
It
But
really
yes,
is.
that's not what we're talking about today. Although we are going to talk about how your sense of feeling, your sensory systems, in addition to your vestibular systems, do play a role, because that's something I learned just in the pre-chats for this event. But yes, we have two very special guests today, and I'm going to read their bios because I think they're quite impressive, and it just really gives a sense of their research backgrounds and where they're coming from, that they can address what we're going to talk about so wonderfully. So Anne Graybiel is a institute professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, good old MIT. And she has a laboratory devoted to advancing the understanding of neural circuits related to our moods and motivation. And these circuits engage the deep forebrain and are implicated in a wide range of neurologic and neuropsychiatric disorders, ranging from Parkinson's and Huntington's to depression and anxiety, OCD, ASD spectrum, and even schizophrenia and bipolar spectrum disorders. And these circuits are also really vulnerable in aging. They exhibit markers of onset Alzheimer's, early onset, and affect key neuromodulators in the brain and their sensitivity to many drugs of use. And the laboratory is dedicated to discovering these neural mechanisms and genes that underlie the functions of these circuits in order to better help individuals with these problems. And Anne is joined today in the same Zoom room, in the same physical space, by James Lackner. And James is the director of the Ashton Graybiel Spatial Orientation Laboratory and the Rickless Professor of Physiology at Brandeis University. He also studied at MIT, and the laboratory that he runs has the only live-in rotating artificial gravity facility in the United States, as well as comprehensive facilities for studying virtually all aspects of human movement control orientation. And they do experiments with parabolic flights, some of which we'll talk about today, space flight, artificial gravity environments, and labyrinthine loss, deaf and blind individuals. And we'll get more detail about the whole labyrinthine system for you. And those experiments have revealed how rapidly humans can adapt to unusual force conditions and how surprisingly complex our sensory motor adaptations to Earth's gravity are, although we don't directly consciously sense or plan them. And that is extremely important because we have humans that are going out of Earth's gravity or in lesser gravitational fields. And so today we're really going to get into sort of how we've studied motion sickness, both in astronauts and in people with these labyrinthine disorders. So actually, if we could just start with a terminology sort of, so we can all be on the same page. Can you explain real quick, James, what the labyrinthine system is, the vestibular system, sort of the components that we'll probably be hearing a lot about today?
Yes, the components are really angular accelerometers, the semicircular canals of the inner ear, of which there are 3 on either side of the head, and what are known as the otolith organs, which are gravity and linear acceleration sensitive organs, of which there are 2 on either side of the head. And together they make up the non-acoustic component of the labyrinth. And many of the labyrinthine loss and labyrinthine defective subjects have lost both vestibular, that's those organs I just mentioned, and hearing, but some have only lost the vestibular organs, the semicircular canals and the otolith organs.
Right, so today we're going to hear a lot about LD subjects. And so those are the people that are labyrinthine deficient, and they may or may not be deaf. Right. There's a little bit of a spectrum allowed for there. Okay, so also before we go any farther, Anne, would you like to tell us why you two are in the same room?
Well,
Why you're doing this event together? Why it's so perfect?
one, I'm in love with him, and two, I'm married to him, and
vice versa.
And we met a long time ago at MIT, and that works out very well. And I brought Jim home at a certain point, and he met my dad, who was working on the vestibular system in a major way. And then after a couple of years, I told my dad that Jim was doing an interesting experiment, that he had a vibrator like you can buy at a store or something. And somebody had shown, a famous English scientist had shown that if you stimulate like the biceps, you can get an illusion of motion. Same with the triceps. And so Jim was having a lot of fun with that because he was studying illusions. I hope he'll tell you about a famous one, Pinocchio. So I told my father, and that really was the beginning of a long collaboration. Dad was, he was, well, I'll tell you later if you ask me about him, but that's how we got together. And then the rest.
Actually, there's more to it, which is I first saw Anne at a seminar at MIT, and then we became students together. And then we started talking, and I told her about beetles, and she told me about bats, and we kept talking, and that's sort of a quintessential MIT mating paradigm. And 5 years later, we got married, and then it was more birds and bees.
Well said. I love it. And yes, Anne, I would love to talk about your father because what I didn't necessarily clarify is that the lab that Jim runs is, or that James is running, is named after your dad. And it was your dad's lab, I assume, to start with, right? So your dad is Ashton Graybiel.
He is Ashton Graybiel, and he actually was in Pensacola, Florida, where the Navy trains its pilots, okay? And there's a big naval air station there, and there was in the day. And so he actually was at Harvard. He had gone to Harvard, and then he was at Harvard Medical School and was part of the Harvard Fatigue Lab there, and very interested in all kinds of things about physiology and cardiology. So he worked on the heart and related systems. And what happened was that during the war, our pilots were really having trouble. And so they called my father down, this is in wartime, and said, you go to Pensacola right now, and it must be fatigue, and you're at the Harvard Fatigue Lab.
And this is World War II.
This is World War II. So what happened, I wasn't there yet.
Right.
Wasn't around yet. So what happened was he went down there, he found out that in fact, they were disoriented. And why were they disoriented? Well, was a physiologist, and turned out, the canals in the otoliths were the problem. So it really, in retrospect, and I thank you for this because I really thought about it as more than just loving my father, he really was amazing. This fellow continued to do cardiology. He wrote 2 textbooks of cardiology, one during the war. I remember as a kid that he still saw patients because sometimes at dinner time, in the old days, we all had dinner together, if we can remember back then, a call would come to see a patient and he would go. At the very same time, he was building up a many-building lab complex with many different devices with which to probe aspects of the vestibular system and how they interacted with the whole physiology of the body, everything from sleep to orientation. And it really is amazing that it just so happens that Jim was very interested in all those issues. And when they met, my father just thought Jim was, the most wonderful guy. So I spent many weeks here alone in Boston, in Cambridge, while Jim was down there. So darn it, it was great.
Yeah. So anyway, he had a huge laboratory complex in Pensacola, and we started collaborating about 4 years after Ann and I got married, and I had discovered some ways to create illusions of whole body movement and illusions of head movement involving muscle vibration. And Ann had told him about it, and so he wanted to experience this. So I went with him one afternoon to the lab, and we started doing some experiments on each other. And as a control, he put the vibrator on his head, and suddenly I could see his eyes bouncing up and down. And what had happened, he didn't have much insulation. He was bald, so it was a pretty direct contact. We had activated the vestibular system, and then we found that by regional vibration of the head, we could activate different vestibular receptors. And about 6 weeks later, we had our first publication. And then from that point on, Anne became sort of a,
I was just, I worked up here, he worked down there an awful lot. They really were so close. It's just a grace, really. I don't know how else to put it, that these two got together. And I had been interested. I mean, I worked for many hours with my father. He would get up very early in the morning and work, meaning he was in his den.
Yeah, there he is. That's a photo of your dad. Yeah.
I think this was the relevant photo, right, with the lack of insulation?
Yep, absolutely.
Oh,
Josh, you want to draw that on?
Just 1 second. There we go.
Anyway, what's interesting is we worked together for a number of years, but I very quickly got involved. Are we still on?
Yep.
I very quickly got involved. He at this point was almost 80 years old.
but going like mad.
Going like crazy. And pretty soon I took over the responsibility for the parabolic flight experiments. And I was being supported by NASA, as he was as well, but on separate grants. And so for a number of years, I conducted the parabolic flight experiments. And then the point came where he was 80 and had to retire. And we had this ongoing programs, both at Brandeis and at Pensacola. And NASA was so interested in the parabolic flight experiments we're doing, and so pleased with the results of the collaboration, which had brought many, many publications and discoveries. And they decided that they would move everything to Brandeis. So suddenly Brandeis, where I had my laboratory, which had originally been given $1,000 startup money, suddenly
I got
with
none.
with the flip of a pen by Larry Dietlein, Associate Director of Life Sciences at the Johnson Space Center, transferred all of NASA's equipment in Pensacola to Brandeis, anything that was movable.
Mhm.
And then the funding was shifted to Brandeis, and also funding to build a slow rotation room, which we built, a much larger one than the one we'll talk about in Pensacola in a while. But I thought, given that suddenly the most comprehensive laboratory for studying orientation in the world was going to be at Brandeis, that it ought to be named in his honor. And Hank Foster, who was chairman of the board of trustees of Brandeis, made that possible. And so suddenly everything came to Brandeis, and there was an international symposium in his honor and the naming of the laboratory. And over the next 5 years, we constructed the new slow rotation room, which still is unique, and just kept doing new experiments. And he continued to participate almost till he was 90. And then our last paper was, he was 89 years old. And it was a wonderful, he was brilliant, he was energetic, but he was imaginative, and he was a seer. And the work he did really had to do with thinking about not just the coming space flights that were going to go long duration and possibly to Mars and so on, but also what would we need to know? And the interesting thing is that his first studies with the labyrinthine defective subjects, and here Jean Burgee of Gallaudet and John Allen of NASA headquarters are really very important, because they've put together a collection of a list and of all these labyrinthine defective studies that were done at Pensacola. And it's a very long list. And what's important is most people don't know the content of those studies. And in fact, I wasn't familiar with many of them. And I think that what they reveal and what we've found in other studies that we've done at the Graybill Laboratory is that one of the most interesting, important things that can be done for future exploration of space is additional studies of those kinds of individuals who are really amazing. And just one final point, which is the first labyrinthine defective subjects that he tested were prior to the first human space flights.
Right. Yeah,
so he was really a seer.
He was always, he always thought he was bursting with energy, but not
long-sighted.
Yeah, just, it was perfect. So he talked to me also about what came to be called the LD subjects. And he,
that was an expression of love for him.
He was a physician. I just want to
joy.
say that he was a true physician. He cared about people. He cared about them so much. And I had the good fortune to meet some of these individuals from Gallaudet, and I never will forget it. They were
Can we talk
so kind and wonderful.
Yeah, can we talk about Pensacola and some of the tests he was running? You mentioned the rotating room.
Yes.
And I know
we had a figure of that. We have somewhere a picture.
Yeah. Yes, I think it's number 2, Pensacola rotating room.
Got it.
Can you describe like what this room is and what took place inside it during what kind of tests they were doing?
Like it was big.
One thing is it was 15 feet in diameter, and they could run studies which would go for minutes or hours or days or even weeks. And a lot of the LD subjects took part in those. Many of them took part for, even week-long experiments. And what was interesting was—
So they would live in the room?
Live in the room.
So can you imagine what it took to organize this, that they could be in that room?
And is it spinning, symmetrically on an axis, or is it off axis? Or
it's on axis, and they have a center post, center rotation post in the room. So you can't stand at the center rotation because there's a post there. But then as you move away from the post, when it's turning at constant velocity, you get exposed to a greater and greater centripetal force. And it turns out that when you move in a rotating environment, your movements get perturbed by what are known as Coriolis forces that we can talk more about later if you wish. And the interesting thing was these unusual forces in the rotating room also affect head movements and stimulate the vestibular system. And that was making the control subjects with normal vestibular systems motion sick, especially when you got around greater than 3, 4, or 5 RPM.
I at one time was allowed to go into that room. I don't remember what miracle happened that I could do that. And I was sick within moments. I mean, it was really, so that people vary in how vulnerable they are. And
Yeah.
Jim has done many, many experiments in parabolic flight, and he doesn't get sick and everybody else does. So it's just tough doing.
I think you had sent us an article that was about one of the particular subjects, green bun.
Yes.
And he had kept, or he had written letters, and he talked about a couple times he would not know that they were moving either until he got up and around, or he would just think that everybody else, that because he was the control, so he was the one who had the defectiveness, and he would think that the other three were like overacting at their like inability to do things.
It was amazing because none of the LD subjects got motion sick at all, but the other Navy volunteers virtually all got sick. And even at 10 RPM, which was just devastating for the Navy guys who were participating, the labyrinthine lost subjects would just move their heads happily, no symptoms whatsoever. And the big message in many things that Anne's father did was that even under weightless conditions, high force conditions, there was one study where they had people on a ship in the North Atlantic during a storm, and virtually everybody on the boat got sick. But the labyrinthine lost subjects were just sitting playing cards and having a ball. So no matter what they did, they couldn't make the labyrinthine lost subjects motion sick. And
as you're talking about the RPM, just my analogy here is just that it's kind of like you're living on a blown up record player.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's around.
That's a good way to put it.
Little ones are, 45 RPM, and bigger ones are like roughly in the 30s, right? 33.
Yep. 33.
So, yeah, that's huge. And we're talking at 10, it's blowing their minds kind of thing.
Yeah.
I want to clarify really quickly here. A couple people in chat are a little confused. The image on the screen is a rotating room. And we're not talking about like a carnival ride where it pins you to the wall or anything, right?
No.
It's people standing up in the room like this and going about their day while they're standing up. I drew a little stick figure. It's not somebody standing on the wall like this, like a sci-fi space station or anything, right?
They're walking across it, and they're trying to walk against the walls. And I read some of the tests were playing cards, playing darts, throwing tennis balls.
The really important thing to remember here is that in a rotating room that's turning at constant velocity, when you're in it, you feel totally stationary. It's only when you move or when you're in the periphery, when you're exposed to unusual forces. And if you were exactly at the center of rotation and sitting quietly, you wouldn't think anything unusual was going on.
Because at the center,
don't realize that.
Yeah, at the center, you're just sort of spinning in a circle, right? Like you're just staying still and you're rotating in a circle.
Yep.
Right, but you have a stable.
But you're staring at a wall that's not moving.
You don't sense any rotation whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's no windows as well.
Exactly.
Yeah. I still can't believe they were in there for weeks.
Yes,
Weeks.
They were heroes, and The other thing that's interesting, which isn't all that well known, is that they also studied the effect of alcohol on balance in the labyrinthine loss, as well as the Navy subjects, and doses of alcohol that would make the Navy people unbalanced, LD subjects. But
It's probably one of the rare times that the whatever you call it, like your government per diem would cover alcohol.
Right. That's so fantastic.
I agree.
That's so funny.
One thing that I think is interesting in terms of the labyrinthine loss subjects is some of the most key findings are really not really known to people and their significance. And one of them relates to what's referred to as the oculographic illusion. And I think we have a photo illustrating.
Yeah, number 2, oculographic. Yeah, what is oculographic? I think it's eyes and gravity.
Yes,
somehow.
Nice.
Got it.
yeah. Now, if we can see, that's a complicated figure, but what's really important to understand is that what you're seeing is an illustration, it's sort of a cutout of the slow rotation room, and it's turning at constant velocity. And there's a subject who's actually seated upright, but what's shown is what the subject is perceiving during rotation. And what it's showing is what happens when you have a centripetal force and the force of gravity simultaneously act on the individual. The individual's in the periphery and is rotating counterclockwise with the room, which is rotating counterclockwise. So he's facing the direction of rotation. And what's being shown is what the individual experiences, which is rightward body tilt. And at the same time as the person is looking at a line of light, the line of light seems to rotate with him. And this is referred to as the oculographic illusion. And in order for the subject to see the line of light as being horizontal, it has to be rotated counterclockwise by the amount of the rotation of the resultant force acting on the subject.
That was good because it gave them a way to actually measure, they could measure in degrees or parts of degrees as the subject indicated what he experienced. Otherwise, sometimes it's very difficult to get kind of numbers on the subject, on the experiments.
Right.
So it was really turned out to be useful in addition to being important.
So to make sure I understand this,
You're facing, you're not
is sitting down and the center of the room is off to one side of them?
Yes, you're in the periphery.
Yeah, you're
but
against
they're
one wall.
facing, they're rotated, so they're facing, their shoulder is near the wall.
Yeah, right. And then, but you're looking for a beam of light as well. There's a beam of light that
There's a line of light that's projected.
Austin's drawing for.
I'm drawing. So the person is like, pardon my stick figures, the person is sitting against one wall like this over here, and
Right.
the room is rotating, right?
Perfect. And
That's so good.
see, think of having a ball on a string and twirling it.
Yep.
Yeah.
You have to apply a force on the string, which holds the ball in place in the circular path. Well, the wall of the room is doing that to the subject.
That's so cute, that ball.
Yeah.
Well, it's an experiment in trust. Did they make the length of the string correct so that it doesn't actually come around and get the test subject? That's what you got to look for there. You know the bowling ball they do with inertia?
That's great.
Momentum?
But anyway, what's interesting is then they and Father tested LD subjects. And this illusion was thought to be solely vestibular in origin from the otolith, the linear acceleration sensitive organs of the inner ear. And there's an illustration which shows the time course of the illusion in LD subjects and normal subjects. And John, if you can find that.
Is that the OGVI? Was that
Yes.
similar time? Let's see. Oops, my drawing's still on the top of it. There we go.
Yeah.
The drawing's cuter.
I'm available if you need illustration services.
Okay.
I only
No.
use red, though.
No, what's being shown here, it's the time course. First of all,
What's X and Y?
that's what
I'm sorry.
about to explain. So what's being shown is time on the abscissa, and then on the left scale is being shown degrees in
Degree
terms
tilt.
of the tilt of the resultant force on the subject. And what's being shown with the lines after that, below it, are the time course of the oculographic illusion in the normal subjects and the LD subjects. And what's interesting is the initial time course is the same, but the illusion is very small in the labyrinthine lost subjects, very small,
It's so
but it
interesting.
happens.
It's so interesting. It does start.
Yep.
So would it be safe to say, sort of in this situation, that they start off the same, but then the normal subjects perceive that angle to be growing over time, and the labyrinthine sort of reach a threshold, and then they sort of
It's
feel like
that
it's
peak.
the same.
Yeah.
And this threshold, if you rotate for hours, you can still maintain the same magnitude. But now Anne's father originally had thought that the oculographic illusion was solely due to the otolith organs. And then he thought, well, touch and pressure cues must be affecting things here. So what he did was he got a big tub that you could put the subjects in up to the neck and put them on a centrifuge, and
A
then
barrel.
filled it with water so that they had no pressure cue hard points.
Oh, right, like sensory deprivation in a way.
Exactly. They were spreading out the touch and pressure cues so there would be no salient contact points.
Ah.
And that's illustrated in a slide, not slide, but a photo, the next one, the one adjoining to this.
We have a different set of numbers.
Don't worry.
I have a
Oh,
water immersion graph.
That's
Yeah,
it.
that's it.
There you go.
Yeah.
And what's shown here is the filled elements are the ones that show the labyrinthine lost subjects, and they're the three lower traces.
Yeah.
And the middle, the bottom two of those show that with water immersion, either with a wetsuit or without a wetsuit, when they're immersed, the LD subjects essentially show no illusion. But then the dry condition is shown above the lower two lines. It's that third line filled.
Oh, got it. one
And
with
that's
the
the illusion they get. But then the upper two lines are showing that the control subjects still get the full illusion regardless whether they're in water immersion or not, or in dry conditions. So that the normal subjects, it's primarily otolith organs, labyrinthine defective subjects, it's touch and pressure cues.
But the cool thing is that they could use the touch and pressure cues. And so there was a time period, I don't know in actual calendar years, when Dad just started all the time, TPK systems, touch, pressure, and kinesthesis.
Yeah.
And he read and he read and he read. And I was studying the work of a very notable neurophysiologist, Vernon Mountcastle. And I told Dad about every single study Mount Kessler had done, and he was just absolutely, he could absorb any amount of information and then think ahead. He always thought ahead.
Yeah.
So it was really great. It was wonderful to talk with him.
Yeah.
I want to see real quick. I'm going to turn my camera on, and again, I'm reading chat, and I see a couple people who don't quite understand what we're talking about. So this angle that we're talking about, right? And James, Ann, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the experiment was sitting in that chair like I drew, and you're in the room that's rotating, right?
Yeah.
And you can't see outside. You
That's
feel
right.
that it's rotating, but it's not like you can see outside. And you're
No,
looking
no.
at a line, right? And
Yeah.
the line's not
You're
moving.
sitting-
Well, the line's
You're
going.
sitting upright.
You're sitting upright and you're looking at a line. And because of the rotation of the room, the control subjects thought that line was tilting some number of degrees, correct?
Exactly.
And
But
the
they thought their body was also tilting and the line was tilting with them.
yeah. In the LD subjects with different perception, they didn't have the same cues, so they didn't think that the line was tilting as much. Where the control subjects, they thought the line was tilting a lot. And
Yeah.
I couldn't even share this with you, because if I were to take a live stream camera there and point a live stream camera at the line, you'd be like, "Das, the line's not moving," because
Exactly.
you wouldn't be moving. It's just a video screen, right? Did I get that right?
Yep.
That's
Gotta get you into a classroom at MIT, Jim.
I would be happy to do a cameo. I'll bring my red pen and I'll tilt sideways. And anyways, again, just trying to do a little bit of illustration there for the folks in chat. That's why we do these. But back to y'all.
Well, can we transition to your experiments, especially with the Vomit Comet parabolic flight?
Yes. Why not show the Vomit Comet picture and the illustration of its path? See, at this point that I'm going to start mentioning now, Anne's father and I were working to try and figure out why astronauts are getting motion sick. And so what we were doing is studying how different kinds of head movements and what makes you sick in weightless conditions and what makes you sick in high force conditions. So we're intentionally pushing the limits in terms of what subjects can tolerate under different conditions of head movement and rotation. And of course, we do all of this on ourselves first. Anne's father was 80s at this point, so not him, but
That's you, right?
yeah, that's me. So anyway, there's a picture of a subject. Actually, it looks in that picture you're showing of me like I'm just hanging around.
Upside down one.
But I'm actually working. And
I'm
if you
actually
show
working.
the picture of the subject.
Sick subject needs fresh bag.
Oh, the free floating one.
That's later.
That one.
Yeah, there's the free floating without contact.
Yeah, let's go back to, there's a picture of a subject who's actually motion sick.
Okay, yeah. Number 3, 6 subject.
Let's see here. There we go. All the way on the end. There we go.
Yeah, so what I'm looking at as I'm free floating there is who's sick and who needs a fresh bag, literally. And so there's someone who's watching who's getting sick, but in the meantime, as soon as we go out of the 0G period, we go into 1.8 to 2G, and I'm hopping around trying to give people who need bags, fresh bags, and putting the others away.
Wow.
And what happens is, as I'm moving around in 2G, it seems like the airplane's doing crazy stuff. Like as I move in relation to the aircraft and step, it seems like it's rising up and going down, and I feel the deck going up and down. And so we actually did a set of experiments to look at deep knee bends during exposure to increased force level. And I think there's a picture illustrating that. And yeah, what that's showing is if you do a deep knee bend during exposure to high G, it feels like as you lower down that the aircraft rises up under your feet and prematurely flexes your knees. And when you raise up, it feels like your immense effort, because your body weight is doubled, is pushing the aircraft downward.
Huh.
Now, what's fascinating is if you keep doing it over several parabolas, the effect goes away. Pretty soon it feels normal to make those movements. And the other thing is that once it feels normal, if you go to 1G from 1.8G deep knee bends, suddenly you get a reverse illusion. It feels like as you lower down, the aircraft moves downward under your feet. And the real interesting thing here is how rapidly that adaptation occurs. And I've had tens of thousands of parabolas, and most of the people in my group at the Grabio Lab have too. And now we usually, during experiments, when our attention is completely occupied, we often have to look at an accelerometer to know whether we're in 0, 1, or 2G.
No kidding.
Wow.
Wow.
No, it's amazing.
Wow.
Now,
I didn't know
there's
that.
it's amazing.
You've got your parabolic legs, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Sea legs,
Exactly.
parabolic legs.
And this
they
was
last a long time.
yeah. The
Now
knee
there's-
bend is for normal people or for LD?
LD subjects haven't been tested in this, but
Got
I
it.
would expect them to show the same illusions.
Got it.
But now show the picture free floating near the ceiling of the aircraft, because that creates an interesting situation. Here, what I've been looking at, everybody who we were testing is now done for the day, but we've still got extra parabolas, but they've hung up their hats and are just sitting quietly. And so I'm now exploring how different orientations and viewpoints with respect to the aircraft affect my sense of orientation. And it turns out that how your gaze is directed is important, but the thing I want to emphasize is here, if without any contact whatsoever, you close your eyes, suddenly it's sort of like you're non-oriented. Cognitively, you know you're floating. You know what your position is, but you don't feel in that position. But if I touch the fuselage with my finger, I feel oriented. So it's going back to the importance of those touch and pressure cues for having a sense of
And also, if I could
orientation.
just say one thing, is I work on neuroplasticity in the brain,
Right.
on real brain. And I don't think anyone in the world possibly understands how we get this instantaneous change of the entire perception of self and environment. I mean, now people have found there are many different wonderful phenomena, but this plasticity that Jim and Dad worked on is it's absolutely unrivaled.
Yeah, it's amazing. So speaking of this sense of touch, because we always run out of time doing this event because it's so
Right.
much fun to get caught up in every different thing we're talking about. But I would love to talk about the turn and reach
Yes.
experiment that we talked about before, where that was playing, the gravity field was playing a role in
Yes.
being able to
Yeah.
orient yourself. Can you explain the setup for that?
Yeah. Why don't we go to the rotating room illustration first with the test configuration and conditions.
Okay, so the diagram version of this.
Well, that's the picture of the Brandeis slow rotation.
Oh, wonderful.
Which is 22 feet in diameter. Its volume is twice that of the original room. And the important thing is it doesn't have a center post, and we can test people right at the center post, which means that if you're rotating and you're at the center, you feel absolutely normal.
Right.
Now, if you looked for the test configuration and conditions in that, yes, here's what I want you to concentrate on. This is a subject at the center of rotation. And what's important here is that person's seated at a table, and they're going to point to a target on the table surface. They're themselves at the center of rotation. When they push down a button, a laser target appears and they point to it. But what happens is they point to it in the dark so that the room lights will be off. And there are three conditions: pre-rotation, per-rotation, and post-rotation. And
do we have a diagram?
And there's
some data.
Yeah, let's show some data. And what's interesting is if you're in that situation and you're turning at 10 RPM, a Coriolis force is generated on your reaching arm. And what that means is that there's a force which is inertial, which deviates your arm rightward during counterclockwise rotation. And
it's right after.
Can we look at the normal results first?
That is the normal subjects completely adapt?
No, yes, right.
Yes, we aren't going to talk about the LD subjects.
Yeah,
just the normal subjects.
There you go.
So there's the normal subjects.
Yep, and what's being shown, this is the average of many subjects. And what's shown is that
that's right.
Pre-rotation, they reach straight. Per rotation, initially their reaches are deviated. And what happens is subjects will, during the first reaches during rotation, will reach it and they'll say, oh my God, or gee whiz, my arm didn't do what I intended. And then they'll keep reaching and slowly they'll say the force is going away now. Whatever happened to my arm is now gone. And at that point, during constant velocity rotation, with the same magnitude Coriolis force on their arm during the reaches, they're reaching accurately and they no longer sense the Coriolis force. Now, that's sort of amazing in a way, and it happens in a very small number of reaches. Within 20 reaches, it's virtually gone. You stop rotation and they reach in, holy cow, it's back. And but it's in the opposite direction. And then slowly it decays over time. Now, we did that with labyrinthine lost subjects as well, and they showed a slightly different pattern. They showed the basic adaptation, but they never completely adapted their endpoint during per rotation. And I don't have time to go into why that's the case, but let's go to the turn and reach paradigm, because one of the things that we wondered about, and when I say we, here I'm talking about my colleague Paul DeZio and I, Graybiel is retired at this point, and our initial studies were with the reaching movements, as I've mentioned, but we wondered, why would you adapt so rapidly? What is going on? This is such a crazy environment. Why would we adapt so quickly? And, you know, when you think about artificial gravity as being disruptive to performance and so on, it's mainly the head movements that are the problem, it turns out. But we asked the question, well, is there anything that happens in everyday life that would explain why you adapt so rapidly? And it turns out that whenever we simultaneously rotate our torso and reach, that we are our own artificial gravity environments. What happens is, it turns out that normal subjects will simultaneously reach peak velocity in their torso rotation and their arm velocity simultaneously, virtually, which means there's a Coriolis force being generated on your arm. And it's maximized by that pattern of simultaneous turn and reach. And when you calculate what the forces actually are, it turns out that during a typical reach like that, they're about twice what the Coriolis forces are in the rotating room in the experiment I just described. Namely, they would deviate your arm twice as far. And
are these great big numerically, like?
They're substantial, and we've done calculations to judge their magnitude, but here you can see the perfect overlap of the torso reach. But what is important to recognize is we don't sense the self-generated Coriolis force. The nervous system is anticipating them.
Huh.
And we actually have a device which allows us to remap the relationship between turning of the body with respect to space and the turning of the body with respect to the ankles. And when you do that, what happens is you can create a situation in which a person feels that they're turning 30 degrees with respect to external space, but are only turning 20 degrees with respect to external space. And if you adapt them like that and have them make a reaching movement, then suddenly they'll overshoot the target because they're expecting a Coriolis force of a greater magnitude than is actually present.
I think one of the most incredible things that Jim and my father have come up with is that this whole thing is transparent. We know that we hear and we know that we see, right, and smell and all of that, but we're not aware of all these, odorless and semicircular canal signals. And I think you, Summer, brought up when you learned how much force is applied to a leg, right? When
you're just walking in my statics engineering class, that like 500 pounds on your.
Listen to that. Yes. So what Jim is saying so nicely is that we don't sense of stuff, but it's huge. And it's changed my way of perceiving the world lately, because Jim's been talking about he's all excited about these experiments, and he's talking, and suddenly I feel like I'm aware now, much more aware, and it's not nice.
It's not nice.
So it's really great that it's transparent.
There's a fun video that I'd like to show, which shows a labyrinthine lost subject being aided by light touch contact of the index finger.
Good.
Based on some of the findings in parabolic flight, we came up with a set of studies which has elicited thousands of follow-up studies.
Did I get the right one here?
That's the correct one. And let's not quite play it yet, but what is going to be shown is a labyrinthine loss subject, complete labyrinthine loss in a heel to toe position. And we're recording her position in space and the forces she's applying with her feet. And in one case, we'll allow her to touch a stable surface, and she can apply about 40 grams of force, and that will stabilize her. And it's absolutely amazing. And this touch stabilization works for labyrinthine lost people, normal people, people with Parkinson's, you know, on and on
What
it
is
goes.
40
grams is about
feel
an
like?
ounce and a half. It's about the touch when you just lightly touch a
And
surface
that will stabilize?
your body, probably by virtue of what I refer to as a long loop cortical reflex. In other words, what happens is slight changes in force at the fingertip, which reflect your sway, activate receptors in the fingertip, which then lead to changes about 125 milliseconds later in the electrical activity in your leg muscles, which 150 milliseconds later causes correction of the center of pressure under your feet.
It's
to
a miracle.
stabilize your balance.
The brain is a miracle.
But
It is.
let's look at it with no touch. And I'm doing what's, I'm trying to spot her so that if she can't fall over, she grabs on.
So you're in the sweater?
I'm in the sweater. And she's got safety railings, but you can see her fall side to side. And now in a few seconds, there will be another trial. And in the next trial, she'll be able to touch and you'll be able to see the difference.
So this is the touch trial where she's allowed.
Yep.
Oh, wow.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
Just that one extra point of contact, that one extra bit of input, you know?
Yep.
Well,
Absolutely.
it's a trick I use in my life every day.
Yep.
When my lab is on the 6th floor, and I always walk up and I walk down, but now I just slightly touch the railing once in a while just to preserve orientation. It's a very good thing for people to do.
What
I wonder if I
that's a
could,
great tip.
No kidding.
maybe, do we have time for just one more picture?
James, we have as much time as you'd like to keep sharing
Absolutely.
us with stuff here. We are in the
Okay.
Q&A, but the Q&A queue is a little short, so we have some extra time here.
Go
Don't
for it.
worry about it.
Okay, why don't then we show the next video.
Positional awareness during control of vehicle? It was a 6.
Yeah, cluster 6, loss of positional awareness. Let me just explain what this is going to show. This is a multi-axis rotation device that's programmed as an inverted pendulum. So the subject, Vivek, is in it, and Vivek is going to try and use the joystick to balance the device that he's sitting in, the chair he's sitting in, at the direction of balance of the inverted pendulum, which is vertical. And in this circumstance, he has positional cues from the pattern of touch and pressure distribution on his body, but also force of gravity acting on the otolith organs of his inner ear. So he has gravity dependent information. And then what's going to happen is we'll rotate him backwards so that his torso is supine, but it'll still be inverted pendulum behavior that he's trying to control with the joystick. But now his head is perpendicular to the direction of gravity. So he doesn't have any gravity cues about his changing position, just temporary touch and pressure cues and some semicircular canal cues that would signal angular acceleration.
And when you say inverted pendulum, you are balancing a pin on your finger for a second. That's sort of like an inverted pendulum, right? Instead of hanging down, you're like balancing up. So this whole chair is like balancing, like you were trying to balance a pin on your finger, right?
Yep,
Gotcha.
exactly.
All right.
Perfect. Yeah.
So you roll the tape?
Yes, please.
Pull it.
And if he goes beyond 60 degrees, the chair automatically is reset to the start position at the direction of balance. You can see he's doing pretty well. He's blindfolded, of course.
Yeah.
And now he's been
Rotating.
back.
This is like the launch position.
So what's going on?
He's watched the device, look at it oscillate.
And it's because there's certain
Now he's lost control.
gravitationally
He's
bound,
gone 60 degrees.
Huh.
right?
He
So
doesn't know where he is.
taking away one of his
He doesn't know where
sensors.
he is.
I'm going to play that one again. That one was a little shorter than I thought.
Okay.
There we go.
Yeah,
So this is the upright, where you sort of have your head's moving back and forth, and so you get that
Exactly.
extra bit of sense, right?
exactly.
Your head's leaning one way, or your head's leaning the other way, and that helps you stay balanced. But then when you
Yeah.
lose that, because you lay back to the supine position, sort of the launch position, I said, you don't have that same sort of input from your head, from your ears, from your vestibular system, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I want
It's
to visit
sort of
and
a
try all
model.
these things. Like, can I sign up, like a waiver or something? And
Absolutely. We'd love to have you.
I'll bring a camera out. We'll like do this live and see if I can keep vertical in the chair. Like,
Let's go together. I'm in.
yeah, right.
No, the strange thing is when you're on your back in that device,
Yeah.
people can lose direction sense. They can be 180 degrees off.
No kidding.
It's sort of like your people lose track of where they are and
But
don't
when
have
we're
any.
But when we just lie down
Yeah.
on the bed, that's not what happens.
No, but when you're lying down on the bed, you're horizontal and the bed's not moving unless you've been drinking.
I can tell if my feet are sticking out from the covers or not, and that helps orient me in the bed. Like, if my feet are sticking out and they're cold, I know that I'm sidewards. I have that
Well,
extra data point.
Yeah, well, an interesting thing, Graybill and I, in some of the first experiments we did, were testing subjects, measuring susceptibility to motion sickness during what we call Z-axis recumbent rotation, where you're rotated barbecue spit fashion, but with a more humane method of attachment to the device. And what we thought was we would look at the effect of fluid displacements on susceptibility, because when you go into weightless conditions, you lose hydrostatic pressure in the circulatory system. So there's a headward displacement of
Right.
blood and body fluids, which
Yeah, and your face.
now
puffs.
are, and you get the puffy summers, right? You get the puffy faces of space flight with engorgement of the venous return of the face as well, which will persist. But the first recorded instances of space motion sickness are within an hour. And we looked at the effect of fluid redistribution for different extensive tilt as a function of rotation to see whether or not we would see a difference for different magnitudes of fluid shift. We didn't find a difference, but we did find, huge fluid shifts. But we also found was when you were in this device and you're actually horizontal, most people felt head down. And in all sorts of other conditions, we found that people feel head down when they're purely horizontal. And probably one of the reasons you feel horizontal and not head down when you're in your bed is because you have cognitive awareness and have mapped the dimensions of your bed and its orientation. And that when we put you in an experimental device, if we actually put you in that same supine position, you'll feel considerably head down.
This is all incredible. Before, one of the things I do want to wrap up with is what you're currently working on. But if we go back to the beginning, we talked about how Anne, your dad, his subjects were, or the majority of them, or one group of them were students from Gallaudet. Can you remind me how that happened? He was already in touch with the people at Gallaudet, and how do they select those lucky people who get to do motion sickness?
I think that Jim has a really wonderful story about this, because he's now in contact with the people at Gallaudet again.
Oh, wonderful.
And all I can say is that my father would, as we said, he was full of imagination, right? And so he would think of these possibilities the way a physician, or especially a physiologist, would think of it. You know, if you have a heart murmur, for example, maybe there's trouble with oscillatory activity, and maybe that's related to this kind of receptor, and you need so and so on. So he had that fundamental ability to go from A to B to C to D to E.
Yeah.
And it made perfect sense. You know, if you want to study how this works, let's look at what happens when that particular system is ablated.
Yes,
and
exactly.
It is ablated endogenously in many of the LD subjects. And so they really are, you know, we talked about how they're heroes, and they're really wonderful. They've given so much to science, trying to help other people. So it's really quite remarkable.
Yeah, the picture you just put up was always on Dr. Graybale's office door. I'm sorry, office wall. Yeah. He treasured these people. And he was really a seer. He thought long-term, because he constructed the rotating room in Pensacola to study not just the effective acceleration on pilots, but also the effect of living in an artificial gravity environment, because he thought in the future we probably would have rotating space vehicles to generate artificial gravity. And he also realized that there would be influences on balance and locomotion. And so he was very interested in studying those. But at the time he was working, we didn't really have effective tools for measuring the real kinematics of movement in a way that allowed you to collect data and be able to analyze and compute forces without immense effort. Now we have video recording techniques that allow you to get 1 millimeter of accuracy with 6 degrees of freedom. And so there is a revolution in terms of what we can measure and achieve in relatively short periods of time. And I think that one of the things we're planning to do is to, and Jean Bergy and the Gallaudet group are involved deeply in this, will be to try and gather a new group of labyrinthine loss individuals, both with gradual loss as well as with sudden loss, to explore some of the issues that their results have raised with regard to how do we separate touch and pressure cues from other things, from vestibular function. And let me back up just for a second and go back to the rotating room pointing experiments. I mentioned that we did them with labyrinthine lost subjects, but there was one slight difference in their performance. During rotation, they never showed complete endpoint adaptation in terms of getting back to the target completely correctly. But they showed re-straightening of the trajectory. In other words, when you saw those traces, you were looking at an overhead view of the motion of the fingertip through space. And we couldn't figure out why they didn't fully adapt. And then we thought, oh my gosh, why don't we, since we have all the, and thank you, Anne, for pointing this out, we had all the detailed ability to look at the full three-dimensional aspect of the reach. What we found was that when they reached, instead of reaching and touching like that, they would reach and then they would come down like that. So they terminated their reach differently. They terminated it by coming down vertically, slowly. And the reason was, remember, they were reaching in the dark and the target light went out with the onset of the reach. They were trying to avoid jamming their fingertip because they had a less good idea of their torso orientation without all sorts of contact cues. And we then went and got a force plate where we could project targets on and had people reach to different locations on the force plate, and we could measure the shear forces on the fingertip at landing. And what we found was that for the first 50 milliseconds after impact, there's a vector composed of the different shear component forces that points at the shoulder of the reaching arm, which tells you where your finger is with respect to your body. And that is very important in terms of calibrating and maintaining our calibration of our sense of touch and our sense of the location of our arm. And the important thing is, in weightless conditions, you are floating around, and right now I have canonical positions from which I can reach. I'm limited by gravity and limited by the effective gravity on my body. In parabolic flight and weightlessness, you can free float and flip upside down and do what you want, but you don't have regular shear forces associated with finger contact. And reaching accuracy, of course, diminishes in weightless conditions.
That's fascinating.
So we're seeing how the body calibrates and tunes itself, and probably the hands are very important in our cortical representations of our perceptions of our body shape. Anne mentioned some of the vibration illusions, and you can create illusion by putting your hands on your torso, your waist, and then vibrate, say, your biceps muscles, and someone else will do the vibrating, and you close your eyes, and it'll feel like your hands have moved together and your waist is tiny. The only problem is that when you stop the vibration, it goes right back to where it was.
Amazing.
So,
you want to go to some questions?
Yes.
Sure, maybe one slide, not slide, but picture first for a home experiment.
Sure.
Okay.
And that's it's an experiment you can do at home, and it involves standing on 1 foot versus 2 feet. And think of going to the gym and you are in a seated position and you push with your feet, both feet, to move a load of, say, 160 pounds. And it's very effortful. And you take 1 foot away and you'll feel like your remaining foot is going to be damaged by the rebound of the device.
Huh.
Now stand up, and not everybody has fig leaves available, but if you're not shy, you can do the experiment without it. Lift one foot, and you'll find that although this force on your stance foot has doubled, it doesn't feel like it at all.
Huh.
And that's an illusion. The force has doubled. It's just that that's not interesting information to your nervous system. And it would be very troublesome if every time we moved, we had to take into account the exact forces that are generated, because that would be very complicated. And the other thing is, we actually don't know what we're doing when we make a reaching movement. The nervous system more or less does it for us. We decide to reach to the computer top, and we have no idea which muscles are involved, which nerves. We can figure it out with years of effort. But usually we also forget to take into account that the rest of the body's involved.
Yeah.
It's like an algorithm. You just
So we have very complicated.
it does all the things.
Yeah.
It's interesting that it's so interesting to me as somebody who works on the brain, and works on Parkinson's related issues, because the problem, one of the problems that these people have is that, they want a point also.
Right.
But somehow there's a disconnect between their brain's conception of what they want to do and the motor system, which is going to do it. And what Jim is saying is that somehow this transparency is part of the problem that they have.
Right.
So they don't know how, among other things, to do a certain thing, because they've never thought about it before, because they never, I can pick up this glass of water. What do I do? I just go and pick up the glass of water.
Right.
But I dare you to write down an essay of what do you do in order to pick up a glass of water?
Yeah.
If you're standing up, you got to start with your feet, et cetera, until you have all the stance. So it's the whole thing is part of a larger global mystery, and just awesome way that evolution has managed to give us a brain whereby we don't have to worry about all these things. And the idea is we're supposed to use it for something else. So why don't we go why don't we try to help people do good things when they're free?
Bringing up the Parkinson's patients is interesting, because that light touch paradigm that I mentioned, that we showed the video of, we, and by we here mean Paul Dazil and Abhijit Bakshi and Eli Rabin, have also been concerned with trying to unstick Parkinson's patients. And we've developed essentially a moving belt, which this Parkinson patient can touch their finger down on and try and follow the belt, and that can unstick them so that they can walk. And so some of these things have clinical applications too, that we're going to explore in more detail over time. But the other thing that's probably worth mentioning, given COVID times, that's a point. There's a picture which shows this Sopite syndrome. And what's interesting about this picture, and And that's Eli Rabin with the black hat on there. This is after a day of parabolic flights that was very intense. And these individuals, Vivian is, you can just see her in the background. They're both essentially totally exhausted and unable to do much of anything at this point. And Graybiel had described something called the Sopite syndrome, which refers to with chronic exposure or prolonged exposure to low-grade vestibular stimulation, that you can get a sense of apathy, a sense of being listless, a sense of fatigue, and just a sense of even personality changes in some individuals. And it's very recently become clear that COVID is also in some cases affecting the vestibular system. And some of these kinds of Sopite type syndromes may be developing in some of these patients. And another case of concern would be the Havana syndrome, where there's been electromagnetic radiation, which is
it's interesting that
probably affecting vestibular
balance
components.
and a sense of whirling or is part of that syndrome that is apparently quite widespread.
Mhm.
And the COVID story is just coming out now. There was just recently quite a result published. But what this all means is that these systems that are so critical to our being able to get about in the world or to do almost anything, these systems are vulnerable. They really are. I mean, semicircular canals work because there's a little bit of fluid that kind of goes back and forth, right?
Yeah.
The otolith organs they work because we've got little rocks inside the ear, literally.
Literally.
Yeah, for being such an important system from an engineer's perspective, they seem quite delicate. Like they're well engineered, but at the same time, like quite delicate.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
very, very, very. And so, I don't know, from the point of view, I'm sorry, I'm just a lay person, but
Some lay person.
If you get
a lay genius.
No, but if you get a cold or you get a head cold, I think a lot of people can get some of these sensations.
I absolutely do when I get a cold.
So you get a little bit of a feel of what having abnormal endolymph, that's the fluid, that pressure in there can do. So, be good and take your vitamin C and, for heaven's sake, wear a mask. I shouldn't say that, but the COVID is so frightening for the long COVID, and for it, I myself don't understand at all how the transmission eventually gets to the vestibular organs. I mean, it's something that I think will be studied a great deal. I think it will be, at first there was nothing about fatigue. Then came, people were, they just were so tired they had to sleep. Then that started a whole new study on COVID. And now with this, it's going to expand even more.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I
shouldn't put my 2 cents in.
Oh, that's okay. No. Hey, luckily, the people in charge of the show, right? I have a couple really quick questions here that we'll try to get in. We only have a couple minutes because we've got the interpreters and the cart and that sort of stuff, the captioning and stuff. So let me see. And it's sort of What's next? Are there other things that we want to study? Like, have we tried a room that's rotating on 2 axes? I don't want to sign up for that experiment.
Right.
Have we talked
Whoever
about, like,
said that, bravo.
there you
Whoever-
go. Like
Wait.
nutrition, does hydration change things? I'm putting a lot of people's questions together
Yes,
here in
yes.
sort of, what do you want to study next?
Well, we're doing a lot of studies at the moment that have to do with virtual environments. And so what the questioner just asked about in terms of rotating in different directions and with different kinds of scenes, we're doing a lot of work involving reorientation illusions and the effect of what being in different kinds of virtual environments does in terms of your sense of balance,
Right.
in terms of there are circumstances where we can induce motion sickness within seconds, which we want to help other people avoid doing
Right.
unintentionally. So that's one component. The other component is we're also doing a lot of work with that device, which you saw that could rotate about multiple axes. And one of the things that happens we can program it to exert inverted pendulum behavior about a yaw axis, this axis.
Okay.
And that's very important because helicopter accidents are very common in whiteout or blackout conditions. And we have paradigms using the inverted pendulum yaw paradigm in which people become just as disoriented as they do on their backs. And we're got a project where with the Navy, which we hope to have funded, that would look at how different kinds of cues allow you to restore your sense of orientation. Whether we can do it with auditory cues, that's probably not going to be adequate, but with some kinds of three-dimensional potential visual cues in the absence of a full scene.
Get them oriented.
Yeah.
That goes right back to the beginning. I realized where my father found that they were disoriented, just the regular pilots.
Yeah.
I mean, pilots not necessarily in helicopters. So it's very, so important in aviation and space.
There's an interesting paper that Anne's father wrote, one of his earliest papers on orientation. And it's talking about pilots who are flying at night and run into turbulence and then will keep flying. And after a half hour or so realize that, oh my gosh, I'm upside down. I'm flying upside down.
Just shaken out of orientation. I hope I don't get on that flight.
Yeah. Exactly. So
no kidding.
The range of what goes on is, and that we can induce in the laboratory or in virtual environments is astonishing.
Yeah.
But the hard part is the range of things that can go on in normal conditions that we might not think would lead to potential disorientation can be huge as well.
Yeah. It makes so much sense. This is one of the most fascinating discussions that we've had on the show here, and thank y'all so much for spending the evening with us. We are out of time in the show today, but this has left me with a lot of stuff to think about. Like every time I turn and reach for something, I'm going to be thinking of the mechanics. Oh, I'm a zero G or I'm an artificial gravity environment now, and my body doesn't care. It can do the math. Truly.
Oh, that's so good. The body can do the math.
It's amazing.
Got it.
Labyrinthine defective subjects turn slowly and reach slowly, or turn and then reach.
Yep.
They avoid the Coriolis forces.
Gotcha. It's just so many things I haven't even thought of. Like even just standing on one leg. My foot doesn't feel like it's holding twice as much when I'm standing on one foot. My body's just handling it for me. So many amazing things like that. But we are out of time for the evening. Again,
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much
Thank
for
you. Good
joining us.
Thank you.
Again, y'all, Ann Graybill, James Lackner. I can't even describe what we just talked about. We talked about so many fascinating things, but just thank you so much for the
And
time.
we thank you. We really thank you.
Oh, this
And
was
we
Thank you.
And the LD subjects.
Yes.
All of the people who helped.
absolutely. I had this. I'll put this on the screen really quick for y'all. There was a thank you card in the things there, so that was thanks to the
good.
following for contributions as well. So
Thank you.
yeah, absolutely.
Bye-bye.
The folks, again, thanks to viewers for joining us as well, wherever you are watching, across Twitch or YouTube or Facebook. If you want to get back, Intrepid does these sorts of things on a regular basis, and you can follow the channel, like and subscribe wherever you're watching from. Make sure you do it. There's all sorts of virtual content. You can tune in with the museum on a regular basis. And then remember, also, these shows are made possible through the NASA Cooperative Agreement awarded to the New York Space Grant Consortium. Highlighted in yellow, I have to say that. And the next Virtual Astronomy Live will take place on Thursday, December 16th at 5 Eastern. We're going to be talking about the Double Asteroid Redirect mission. So NASA's shooting a spacecraft at an asteroid to try and knock it into a little bit different course. We're going to be talking about that next week. Make sure you go to Intrepid Museum and learn more. You can find out more about these streams and stuff. Follow over here on Twitch, twitch.tv Intrepid Museum, or my channel, YouTube. You know which buttons to click across the board. Couple minutes over here. So one more time, James, and thank you so much. Summer, a pleasure as always. And
Oh my gosh, it's
Thank
wonderful.
you all.
it really
Thank you
was.
for having us.
It really
Thank you
was.
so much.
See, we never lack for things to talk about. This is wonderful.
Next time we'll book you for a 3-hour show. How's that?
Okay.
All
Take
right.
care. And thank you.
All right.
Take
Well,
care.
thank you so
Bye-bye.
much, and we will see y'all on the next Virtual
And thank
Astronomy
you
Live.
to the interpreter. I'm just amazed at how beautifully the interpreter has somehow rendered this with it's just I just really
Thank you.
you're just wonderful.
Absolutely.
Thank
All
you,
right.
yeah.
Folks, again, you know how to find the channel. We will see you next time. Thanks so much for joining us for Virtual Astronomy Live with Intrepid Museum this evening.